I'm interviewing Riso. This is July 7th, 2013, and we're going to be talking about songwriting, song registration, and publishing ideas. Rick is a successful songwriter, publisher over many years. Can you tell me, Rick, what was the first song you ever wrote?
Well, at the risk of severely dating myself, it was back in the 1960s, and it was a song, if I remember correctly, about my bass player's girlfriend, and the name of the song was Petaluma Patooner.
Okay.
True story.
And since it was in the 60s, you were what, 2 years old?
Oh,
How,
yeah,
how
right.
old were you then?
Just a memory in my dad's
Yes, right.
recollection, right?
So you were like a early teenager? How old?
I think I was probably the first song I wrote was, it's a little vague, somewhere between 14 and 16.
Okay, okay. Is there a reason that you chose to write a song as opposed to, especially you said it's in the 60s, why you didn't write a poem or paint a picture? What made you choose a song?
Well, it kind of comes down to the fundamentals as to how you're hardwired. I mean, yes, there is a poetic aspect about songwriting, but I am not a poet necessarily. I'm a person that has more musical sensibilities, so it just seemed at the time like the way that I could make a creative expression was
It's a little more natural
in a
for you.
musical idiom and not in a literature approach.
Okay. Do you come from a musical background, a musical family?
I don't come from much of a musical family per se in terms of professional musicians. My dad is Italian descent, very large family. He was one of 14 children. And among my earliest recollections were recollections of a lot of celebration involving music in the family get-togethers. These are people that knew and loved many of the great American songbooks, many of the Italian Americans, like Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, etc., Louis Prima certainly, where they'd get together and you'd hear all kinds of music. It was almost nonstop, and it became something that obviously I became sort of hardwired as a little boy having that in my background.
And so it really was like a part of your life. It wasn't like something strange that you were doing, just all of a sudden you decided to explore music.
No.
As a child, did you play any instruments, or, did you take like serious lessons to learn how to be a songwriter?
Well, I believe my first instrument was a sort of a paper set of drums. They had little paper skins on them, and as you can imagine, with a little guy between 2.5 and 3 years old, that didn't last very long.
Yeah.
The next sort of painful memory of a musical instrument was when I was somewhere between 4.5 and 5, and I was asked to become a part of a Italian tradition, playing a small accordion. And I started playing the accordion when I was either 4 or 5 years old for a little while.
Wow. And that's sort of a keyboard instrument itself, isn't it?
It is a keyboard instrument. It was more fun than anything else because there were lots of buttons on your left hand to push, and of course the black and white keys and the limited keyboard on your right hand. So you just, basically for me, I made more noise than anything else, but it was fun.
Wow. Okay. So you didn't have any formal musical training before you took up the accordion?
No, not at that age. I certainly didn't.
Okay. Just because I know you, and I know that you have a pretty amazing ear for music. And when I say an ear for music, I mean that you can hear a melody and play it without having music in front of you. At what age did you start recognizing that you could actually play or repeat the music that you heard around you?
Well, I've always had sort of an uncanny ability to sort of parrot sounds that were around me. It served me as a studio singer in the last over 3 decades plus of my involvement in the music scene. I think when I would hear something, I was able to duplicate it. I had, from the earliest recollection, a lot of musical sensibilities about me. And from the point that I was about I want to say 15 years old, I had at that point played, I believe, became familiar with playing 11 separate instruments.
Wow.
Yeah, and they were quite varied. A lot of the woodwind instruments, clarinet, saxophone, many of the mouthpiece brass instruments. I played baritone, tuba, trumpet in a jazz stage band when I was in junior high school.
And you mentioned drums.
Yes, I was drums. It sort of took over, again, we're talking circa mid-60s, early 60s, and the way that I could get involved in a rock band, which was sort of kind of a blues alternative rock band,
Okay.
was when I was around 14 years old, and I was a drummer. The thing that became most difficult for me was how can I play an instrument and still provide a good rhythm bass, and
Okay,
I was
okay.
not that gifted. So at that point I morphed into picking up the guitar because there weren't a whole lot of guitar players around that were memorable, at least in my little town where I grew up.
Okay.
And I was able to somehow or other be able to keep a sense of be able to render things melodically, like sing a song and play guitar, either lead or rhythm,
At the same time. Okay. Wow. So you sort of had almost like an evolution through a bunch of musical instruments, from the drums to a keyboard instrument like the
Yeah.
accordion, and then on into woodwinds and brass and strings. So you really have a pretty good overview knowledge of how most instruments work.
Yeah, and let's face it, a guy my size, I'm 5'6", on a good day, sitting behind a set of drums, it was always said that the drummers got many of the best looking girls. I was not seen, so not that that would have helped me anyway, but because I picked up a guitar and was able to go stage front and center, I had a better chance.
Okay, okay.
Money for nothing and your chicks for free, as the song goes.
All right. Do you think that it's necessary to be able to play an instrument to write a song?
I don't think it's necessary. I feel like there has to be some sort of a musical theory base for you to do that.
Okay.
Writing a song is something that pretty much anybody and his brother can do. What differentiates a song from being a truly accessible medium in which somebody else gets what you're trying to say or feels what you're feeling is usually communicated by some knowledge of musical theory.
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to back up just a hair here, just for sort of statistical information. About how many songs do you think you've written in your lifetime?
Probably collectively over a couple hundred.
Okay. Do you have a writing process? In other words, do you write your music first and then your lyrics, or your lyrics first and then do you look for your musical hook or lead line first? Is there, anything like that, or is each song, sort of its own entity?
It is its own entity, and the answer to that question is yes and no. I employ various methods given whether or not it's a song that comes out of an experience that I've had. Many of the songs that I've written, not unlike a lot of songwriters, have had either joyful, most of the songs have come out of learning experiences or experiences that involve loss, personal, emotional, psychological, moments of depression, questioning oneself, what have you. And most of those things, if in my case, being a guitar player, it would be instrument in hand. Sometimes a melodic idea will begin to form around a phrase that comes into mind or a feeling that I'm having. In my case, I'm also a project-oriented writer. I've written many, many dozens of songs.
Now, what does that mean?
Musical libraries. That's where you get an assignment to write in the idiom of a certain style of music, either by yourself or with a co-writer, and you write some form of what's called today a music library, which can be accessed for various media sources as background music. Getting back to the fundamental question, it has to do with, for me, the nugget, the concept of the song will usually come out of something that is a phrase that captures what I'm transitioning through or in. It could be a moment of discovery. It could be a moment of revelation where you think, wow, I never saw anything like that before. Or it could be a moment or something that captures something that I have been reflecting on. I'm also a guy that happens to be stronger mostly in writing lyrics than in writing melodies. Many of my co-writers over the years have been composers who are strong with melodic content or ideas. Many of them would then run this by me. I seem to be best suited to work in sort of an editing mode for a lot of my co-writers where they have ideas. Many of them are very full-blown, and I come in with a sense of singer sensibility to know what might be able to be economizing some of the musical notes, and yet where I seem to have some degree of success, although quite limited in the big picture, as I have a sense of being able to capture in words or phrases that feeling that the composer or co-writer is wanting to communicate on a musical level.
Okay. Is there a specific place where you write? In other words, do you write in your studio or your home or in a journal, or do you record on your cell phone? Or...
No, I don't do that. Most of the day, again, speaking for what's going on in the present, most of what I do is project-oriented writing. I'll either get a co-writer gives me an assignment saying, we have to have a song in 24 hours or 48 hours. Here's the concept I have. Here's the working melody that I have in a small music track that's sent to me. And usually I'll go to work and in many cases can deliver a lyric that is accepted and then is published at that point.
Okay. So I want to talk to you about publishing in a second, but I wanted to ask you about a specific song that I'm aware of that you wrote. I think you wrote it for your mom. Can you talk to us a little bit about that song?
Sure.
What's it called? What have you done with it?
The song you're referring to is called A Lifetime of Love. It's actually gone out to a couple of countries now. Been on YouTube for a while. And it's also a signature theme song for an advertising company called MTI. And they used it as a signature song for, of all things, funeral homes throughout the U.S., Australia, and I'm told in England as well, in Canada. Wherein over the years, I reflected on just the amazing life and example and love of my mother, who passed away about 5.5 years ago after fighting 7 forms of cancer for 15 years. And in about 9 months before she passed, I really felt this movement in my heart and soul to want to give some sort of a musical expression as a tribute to who she was as a woman. And that was my motivating factor in that. I began, how do you condense at that point well over 50 years of life into a couple of verses and a bridge? Well, what I did is I went to work trying to hone down some of the fundamental things. The first line of the song is, from the moment I first opened my eyes, you were there for me, always cared for me. And that right there is an image that any one of us can relate to, because even though we cannot recall being in our mother's arms for the first time, most of us can recall being in those arms oftentimes and being cared for and loved. So the dedication of my mother's life was a lifetime of love that she lived. And so I wanted to do that as a tribute to her. Obviously, there are a lot of people that seem to resonate with that idea, and we think that, at this point, a lifetime of love is far from having seen its useful shelf life. But it really was an honor to begin to put that together, because it was a wedding of a melody that seemed to flow along with the lyric as I got it. And as I put it together, it really did seem to be a wedding that was had a little sort of magical content. I've always referred to it as sort of my wind beneath your wings kind of song.
Okay.
One of those one-size-fits-all for many emotional
situations. Yeah. Okay, so I'm curious. You talk about, decades, obviously, over 50 years of relationship with this woman. How did you choose specific words? How do you find words that capture that kind of a base of sentiment?
Well, some of the ones will, will immediately, at least in my case, will immediately evoke from my soul. That's the word that seems to communicate the feeling that is best describes the feeling that I have. I've always been a writer who started there. I work with a lot of songwriters who that's where it ends, which is not to say in criticism that that's a bad thing. Sometimes the first thing that is evoked is oftentimes your sort of gut reaction or response to what you're really feeling, and that can be a very good thing. And all of us know songs that we've heard stories of. Yep, that was the first thing that came out of me, and that's what went on in the airwaves. And that's a good thing. For me, it's not really been that case. I've always been sort of thought of by my colleagues over the years as being more of a wordsmith. I'm a storyteller in my songs. So as a result, I do a lot of editing. And what I will do oftentimes in my songs, as was the case with A Lifetime of Love, I will take a first draft and then I will begin to go back, literally, some cases, word by word or line by line. And when I find a word, I'd say, now, okay, that seems to communicate what I am wanting to express in this moment. But are there other words that are more expressive or definitive of that feeling? And what I use as a writing tool at that point, along with many others, is I use a thesaurus. And when I look in a thesaurus, I see, wow, this word could mean this, this, and this. And at that point, that could also set me up for a rhythmic feeling inside my writing that would then correspond to the other line that it is going to match both the feeling and the rhythmic meter of the song or phrase of the song.
No, that's great. Okay, so I'll move on a little bit here. Do you have a publishing company?
Yeah, I do have a publishing company. I actually named the publishing company, my first publishing company, after my first child. Her name is Francesca. And we thought we were going to nickname Francesca, this gorgeous Italian name, a more contemporary name, and I thought maybe something had a better handle on it would be something like Frankie. I thought that was fun. Like Frankie was going to be kind of her little nickname. Didn't last very long. So, but the name of the publishing company was right around that time, as a matter of fact, because I had done a song for a lullaby project. I needed to have a publishing company that was associated with that. And so Frankie's Farm Music was born. And Frankie's Farm was the thought that if I was successful and I got some publishing royalties, that would go to Francesca's nest egg, which has been far from the case.
Still awaits. Okay. Okay, now so my next question, I guess, is you mentioned that you had written songs from your mid-teens, but you didn't get married and have a daughter in your mid-teens. So why did you not have a publishing company earlier?
Well, because I was foolish and stupid. The reason being, and I, we all have regrets. And one of my regrets, not unlike a lot of people that are involved in the entertainment industry, is that they are very trusting of others that do have the credentials, that do have the position. You're talking about coming out of an era where acts were born literally overnight in the 60s because they had a great song that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the late 60s and the Flower People movement and all that stuff that was going on. The problem was they were very, very wise, and I say this with somewhat of a broken heart, greedy producers and arrangers and A&R people in those labels that basically saw many of us creative people coming. That we were based, and it just was our ignorance, the thought that maybe we would get some sort of kickback having done this. And when we were writing on contracts,
because you were a nice guy,
often boilerplate generated publishing contracts, you came to realize many of us late, like myself, late in the game. Oh my Lord! I just did an album worth of tunes, and I got not even pennies on the dollars. Whereas the person that I was signing to, his or her record label, receive the lion's share of anything for all times that I was going to make. So there was no real, again, this is sort of a heads up. Get smart about the business aspects of music before you ever commit to any sort of a relationship, because yes, there was money made, but none of that went to my own publishing, because I was told if you really want to get it out there, you need to use our publishing label in order to do that.
Okay. You wrote the songs, so why were they not your songs? Why was it that total strangers, essentially, who owned your publishing, they're the ones that made the money? What is a publishing company? Why do you not get everything when you wrote the song?
Publishing company, and again, don't quote me chapter and verse on this because I'm still a learning process, but the publishing company basically is like an umbrella. It facilitates the usage of the songs in whatever idiom or whatever modality is out there. In this case, we live in a global village. When I was growing up and doing music, it was not so much that way because there wasn't the instantaneous, not only capture of a musical idea or song, but the dissemination of it could not be instant. I mean, when I recorded, there wasn't even overdubs. You had to be good enough to go into a studio, as I did when I was 14 years old, and everybody had to know their parts, and the engineer sat there with his headphones on and made a circular thing like, okay, guys, you're rolling, and the tape began, at which point you had to print it to the tape, and if you messed up, it was back to square one. Now, of course, there were a lot of fancy things that happened down the road from there about cutting the tape and editing the tape and stuff like that. But back to the original question of publishing. The publisher is put in a position, if you give him the authority to do so, when you sign on the dotted line, that he retains the ownership of the licensing and mechanical rights of the songs. It's really kind of an odd thing, because even though a song is copywritten and you have your name on it, as mine were on many, as the sole writer, the person to whom, or the company to whom I signed that song over for the rights of the song, ultimately had the power and authority to decide wherever, however, and whenever that song was to be used or not used. I had recently a situation happen where one of my songs that I had signed publishing rights to, let's see it from this point, was almost 20 years ago that I'd signed this. I had gotten a friend of mine who was on the internet complimenting me on liking my music, and he was from another country, as a matter of fact. His congratulations on this other artist recording one of your songs. And I said, I'm sorry, my friend, you must not know my song, because I know who that artist is and I know he didn't record it. Well, he then sent me, in the moment, as we can do these days, he said, no, I know your songs, Rick. And he sent me an MP3 of a song that was indeed off an album that I had recorded in 1984 with my soundtrack, my musicians, my arrangement, and missing from that soundtrack was my lead vocal, which had been removed. The song had been, a lyric had been rewritten, the song had been retitled, and this is a major artist, and re-released under that new title without me ever being even notified. Now this goes to the file of Ripley's Believe It or Not. Can you even, and there are many, 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 countless stories that are much worse than that. But I bring that up just to convey that there has to be a component where the artist is either surrounded by or is at least educated enough on the business aspects of music, publishing rights, and what have you. It was completely within my rights to contest what happened there, and quite frankly, I didn't have the money to retain a legal team in order to do it. It may happen down the road, I don't know that. But one thing I know for certain is that under my publishing society right now, that song with a new title that I wrote 100%, I am now listed as a 25% writer of that song.
So what songwriting association are you affiliated
Well, the licensing society that I'm with is ASCAP, American Society of Composers and Publishers.
Is there a reason why? Because I know that the two major ones, there are others, but the two major ones are ASCAP and BMI. Is there a reason or a reasoning why you went with ASCAP as opposed to one of the others?
Well, there are probably a couple of reasons. To begin with, when I signed as an ASCAP writer quite a while ago now, I was working with other ASCAP writers.
Okay.
It's pretty simple.
Okay.
And those societies and organizations, when they're doing their surveys, particular music that I was doing at that time was gospel music, contemporary gospel music, and R&B, pop, jazz. And for me, as I looked at it as a young man, it just seemed to be that ASCAP was better at, chasing down what was on the airwaves, so to speak, and giving me a greater possibility of a return on recognizing performances that were going on that I had written.
I believe I'm also correct in the knowledge that ASCAP is actually owned by writers, right? It's like a self-governed society, whereas the other ones are administrated maybe by people or business people.
I'm unaware of that, but I could see how that could be the case.
Do they administrate your publishing,
They do
or
not.
does someone else do that?
They do not. I have a lady that I've used for, 15 years now, I guess now. Her name is Lori Kelly, and she handles all the rights and licensing of my catalog.
And how did you find her? Did you look in the phone book under rights and
No, I
licensing?
sure didn't. I noticed that she was doing some other friends. She came highly recommended.
Okay.
And she's been an amazing person. And her company is great. And
does she take like a percentage, or is it a fee? Okay.
She does, yes.
Do you remember when you were first paid for one of your published songs?
Wow. I do, and I'm so sorry.
Or when you first heard it on the radio or something?
I'm so sorry to be taking the time. It's been a while. So I do remember the first time I think I heard one of my songs on the radio. It was not an original song, but it was a recording that I was on. That was in the late 1960s, and that was, of course, Thrill of Thrills. And all that didn't mean much, but it was exciting, and it really sort of got the juices flowing that you could actually do this and get it out there. As far as actually getting a return, in either mechanical royalty for any of my songs, I think that happened for the first time in the early 1970s. I was a part of a group that had signed with a record label, and upon the sales of those songs, you are issued a royalty based upon the units of sale.
Oh, okay.
And a publishing royalty, in this case a songwriter's royalty for me.
Oh, that's very cool. So I just have a couple of other questions. Could you tell us, like, who are or were your primary musical influences?
Wow. Well, I grew up in a city that I don't know if I'll ever have the privilege of living there again, but it was always been my dream to move back. I moved from Monterey, California, Monterey Peninsula and Carmel, and these magical places in the central coast of California, down to Los Angeles, because in the music industry, you don't have a whole lot of choices for the hub of musical involvement. It was at that time, of course, Los Angeles, and Nashville was another great center for another kind of musical involvement. It certainly would have been New York. But in this case, I moved from Monterey to Los Angeles, and I kind of forgot your question because I got homesick.
Your musical
my
influences.
musical influence. There we go. Yeah. Now I'm coming back to reality, and it's true. In my town, which is a magical town, they have had a legendary jazz festival for many, many years called the Monterey Jazz Festival. It happens usually the early part of September. They also have other festivals like blues festivals and such there. And those influences, at my earliest years, I can recall, actually, it was at the Monterey Fairgrounds on a couple of occasions, literally, forgive me, sneaking under the fence so I could get inside the grounds and just listen to the amazing sounds that were coming out. Many of them were beyond my years or musical comprehension. There was also a section of Monterey called, it was Old Monterey, which is now a beautiful street called Alvarado Street that they've renovated since then. But it was filled with a couple of very well-known jazz clubs down there. And I remember as a young boy going down there in the early evenings, or I guess it was, after the set started, before I had to be home by 10 or whatever. And I would, at that point, be able to listen by the door. And I heard some pretty legendary performers, Dizzy Gillespie being one of them, and others that were very, very formative on my understanding of music, music theory, and the styles of music that I like.
Okay, so one final question. Because I'm going to be sharing this with some beginning songwriters.
I'm so sorry to hear that. I would have contoured my philosophic discourse in a different way if that was it.
Well,
Sorry
so you
about
have
that, guys.
one final opportunity here.
Yes.
Are there any recommendations or suggestions that you could make?
Before we do that, I want to go back to the previous question because
all right.
I waxed a little too long, which is always the case with me. You asked about formative influences in my life vocally. Well, vocally, there certainly were some very strong influences in my life, and one of them was the great Tony Bennett, another great Louis Prima. Certainly there were influences in a large Italian family. You heard a lot of people like Vic Damone, Dean Martin, certainly Frank Sinatra. But the real shaping influences in my life came from other different, more soulful and jazz singers.
Like?
Well, there were many of them. One of them that comes to mind is Mr. Lou Rawls. He was one that I mentioned because I was really into a pianist and a performer called Les McCann, and they did an album together, and I listened to it over and over and over again, and there were a lot of shaping influences came from that. I was an R&B artist. I was an ex-Motown artist and got a lot of R&B influence from people like the great Mr. Donny Hathaway. I actually dedicated, in part, my first solo album to him. He was a tremendous musical influence and vocal influence in my life, and still remains. Of course, the great Stevie Wonder. There are many, many influences of singers in my life, but many of the great blues artists that, the list is so long, but many of the black blues artists, Lightning Hopkins, people that Howlin' Wolf, these are people that may or may not be known, but they certainly shaped my young, adolescent soul into taking me to a place where it was far from where I grew up in Monterey, California.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is
Very
Howlin' Wolf is, I would say, a fair distance from Louis Prima.
Yeah, but the soul is what influences us.
How did you even find those?
Well,
Sorry, I'm
it's
assuming
okay.
you were raised like a little Caucasian boy.
It's fine. Again, growing up in the 60s as a teenager, Monterey was about 2 hours south of San Francisco. And in the San Francisco Haight-Ashbury days, there was a tremendous influence of sort of a musical melting pot that went on. And that's where I was a lot of the time. And so I was hanging out with people that, man, have you heard this band that's been playing at the Fillmore lately, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band? Well, that's a band that came out of the Chicago blues scene, Paul Butterfield being, again, a giant musical influence in my life. The great Michael Bloomfield playing guitar for him. These were all guys that as a guitarist and a singer, in this case, Michael Bloomfield as a guitarist, these are people that were greatly influencing me. Another band that was Eric Clapton was a part of was the John Mayhall Blues Band, which was from England. These got me into the melting pot of the blues. And the deeper that I went in, the deeper soil, literally, into the Delta that I went to. So I studied a lot of the Delta blues artists, and I was known as my nickname in high school bands, because I was in a blues rock band called the John Deacon Society, and we opened for legendary bands like Big Brother and the Holding Company and the Jefferson Airplane at that time, and Cold Blood and Moby Grape, and there were Buffalo Springfield. These were all huge bands in the late 60s, but it just was the fact that I got deeper and deeper entrenched into the blues scene as an Italian-American kid, to the point where much of my identity, both vocally and musically, was in the gritty aspect of the blues. And the only person that I still to this day look up to as being so incredibly authentic and can stand her ground with anybody else. And another great influence in my life musically is Bonnie Raitt. So these are all people that have come to shape my musical identity in large part.
So, do you think that having a musical identity, as to take your words, makes you a better songwriter? Like, how do you correlate the influences that you had musically with your output as a songwriter? How did all of, everything from Louis Prima to Stevie Wonder to Bonnie Raitt, and that's a whole solar system there of music. How did that shape you as a songwriter? How could a beginning songwriter benefit from exposing themselves to more and more music?
Well, again, you're talking about a lot of things in terms of, but I think that they all relate to one thing. What is your musical foundation? You have to have a point of identity, and this is as different as we are as people. I mean, there are going to be things that appeal to you that, like, for example, I didn't mention, in the 60s, obviously, it goes without saying, another huge influence in my life, just from every standpoint, was the Beatles. Much more so than you would think, like a group that seems to be more like what I was talking about where I've gone, like the Rolling Stones. There was another big band out of England that I liked around that same time called the Yardbirds. These are all, again, these things began to converge and began to lay, or at least to reinforce, a musical foundation in my life, or an identity. That identity is something that stays with me to this day. It gives me a foundation upon which I can then step off of and say, okay, and if I took it a more jazz direction or a more blues direction, or if I just tried to expand this whole thing out and remember, what would a pop presentation be like as I do this thing? That all can come to enhance my songwriting ability. And you never quite know in your little bag of tricks what's going to pop out until you hear a melody that can evoke that, or a lyric that would coincide with that feeling. That's the whole idea. If you stay true to your musical identity and then stay teachable, you become the winner, because staying open is something, I mean, the school of musical composition, it truly is, and I have many that are award-winning composers and arrangers. It's a school that one never truly graduates from. And school is always in session, and that's the joy of musical expression, that it is an ongoing process. It's more about the journey than the destination. And that really is where the joy of it is, if you allow yourself to discover that joy, as opposed to going, I gotta finish this song. There are times when you do, and I've had many of those times in wee hours of the morning where, I have a delivery date on a song and I just have to hand it off. But, the process ultimately should involve the joy of creative communication and composition.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Rick Riso, for taking a really nice chunk of time here. I think this is going to be beneficial to everybody that hears it. So we thank you for your time and your talent and your generosity.
You are so welcome. I can only sincerely hope that you have good editing software.
Thank you.
Bye, folks. Thanks for listening.